This is the first time where I've seen my country do something that potentially is going to damage the cohesion of NATO and the trust, which has always been the secret sauce of NATO.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end.
Right now, all eyes are on Washington. But who's actually watching Europe at the moment?
The deepening ties between China, Russia and North Korea would certainly have some in Washington concerned.
And then Daddy has to sometimes use strong language.
The IDF will continue to uphold the ceasefire agreement and will respond firmly to any violation of it.
I'm Roland Oliphant, and this is Battlelines. It's Friday, the 9th of January 2025, and it's been a dramatic week in international affairs. Started with the American raid on Venezuela. By Monday, Nicolas Maduro was in a Manhattan courtroom. That was followed by discussions of an American annexation of Greenland. Then, a dramatic American naval operation to seize control of a Russian-flagged tanker in the frigid waters between Iceland and northern Scotland. While all this is going on, an uprising that could become a revolution has begun to brew in Iran. But what does all this mean? Well, one of the big implications from this week is that the transatlantic alliance is under massive stress. What could happen in the event of a conflict between two of its members? The United States and Denmark in this case. In the many decades of its existence, NATO has seen a number of squabbles between its members. In the 60s and 70s, Britain and Iceland nearly went to war over fishing rights. Charles de Gaulle famously evicted NATO from France. And in Eastern Mediterranean, tensions between Greece and Turkey have never really gone away following the 1974 war in Cyprus. But can the alliance survive America seizing control of Greenland? To answer that question, I turn to someone who knows a bit about the internal workings of NATO, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, a former commander of US ground forces in Europe. I started by asking him to introduce himself.
Ben Hodges, Lieutenant General, U.S. Army, retired from the Army 8 years ago. My last job was commander of U.S. Army in Europe, headquartered in Germany. Today, I do advocacy for different things. I work with several different think tanks, and I do consulting to help explain Europe and the EU and NATO to different companies and investors.
Ben, thank you so much for joining us on Battlelines this week. It's been a kind of remarkable week, and I must admit that when we were thinking about what topic to focus on, we really struggled because there's been, US military intervention in Venezuela, then an extraordinary kind of boarding of a Russian-flagged ship in the North Atlantic, which has an Iranian connection, where there is apparently an uprising that may or may not turn into a revolution. And in the middle of all of this, suddenly the issue of the United States annexing Greenland has come to the fore. And I suppose, actually, if I can, I don't know, abuse your goodwill for a little, I might see if I can get you to reflect on how all of those things interconnect.
It's funny, everything you just listed, and it's not even Friday yet. So.
Exactly. What do you make of this week so far?
What nobody has mentioned in a week is the Epstein files. All these things did not happen because the president is trying to distract from Epstein, but that is one of the byproducts. It's interesting because this year, 2026, is going to be an historically important year, maybe more than most because of the midterm elections that are scheduled for November. And so that's going to affect how the Congress, what it does. Obviously, it's going to affect the president, even though he's not up for re-election. If his party loses the House of Representatives, for example, it becomes much more difficult for him to carry out his agenda. So there are domestic politics that are part of all of this as well. Most of the things that you cited are, in my view, seem to be a manifestation of the implementation of the administration's new national security strategy that came out back in November, where they lay out the assertion that the United States owns the Western Hemisphere and that it's our right to do whatever we want in the Western Hemisphere and to deny others, specifically China and Russia, from taking resources or having access in, quote, our hemisphere. Greenland, Venezuela, the Caribbean, Colombia, Cuba, all of these things, and even our neighbor Canada, the administration sees these as our sphere of influence.
It seems to me that the question of Greenland, which is one of the thing that was really on my mind when I thought we should try and talk to you, seems to have come off the back of, as you say, the Venezuela intervention. As a military man, let's start maybe there with the Venezuelan intervention. We saw a build-up. Were you expecting what happened, and what do you make of it from your experience as a former general?
Nobody should have been surprised that something was going to happen, given the buildup in the Caribbean, the constant strikes on drug boats, the narrative about stopping drugs flowing into America, et cetera, et cetera. But I think now that we've seen what happened back this weekend, this was never about drugs. This is all about oil, and the administration demonstrating that it can use its force wherever and whenever it wants to. Now, I do want to say, as a side note, how impressive the special operators and the intelligence professionals were in carrying out their task. So that, just to say that, hats off to them and well done. But as a commander, whenever I get a mission, I would always say, okay, what's supposed to come after this? What's the purpose of doing this operation? And, the United States, we don't have a good record of having thought through to the end the purpose of why we might go into Iraq or Afghanistan or Vietnam. It's never truly clearly identified as a strategic objective. And in fact, we didn't do it. We haven't done it in Ukraine across several administrations. That's what really struck me about the seizure of President Maduro and his wife. Everybody else is still there. I mean, the regime, it's not regime change. It's just they took out Maduro. And then since then, the administration has been trying to explain how they're going to run Venezuela. We're going to use the threat of military force, and American oil companies are going to come rushing in, and it's all going to be great, and everybody's going to get rich. But yet you've got the same thugs are still in place in Caracas, and you've got suppression of Venezuelan people and journalists there by those thugs. So this is all about oil and demonstrating dominance.
I'd like to turn, if I may, to the question of Greenland. And that's not to downplay what happened in Venezuela, but I feel like the implication of a similar American operation in Greenland, which is now clearly under discussion and which the administration has refused to rule out, presents the possibility of the United States clashing with a NATO ally. You spent years in the US Army. You were commanding the US Army in Europe. Did you ever imagine, did you plan for, did you have contingency plans to fight your NATO allies?
No, not once in 38 years that I was a U.S. Army officer did I ever imagine that, that something like that could possibly happen. Now, of course, it's never been perfect. I mean, when you've got the nature of coalitions and alliances, nations are going to argue with each other. You're going to have tensions, but typically at the military level, the mill-to-mill sort of stuff, the professionals there managed to always maintain the correct relationships. You stayed focused on your tasks and that sort of thing, even while the civilian leadership above you might be engaged in pretty harsh arguments. And of course, people will remember that France kicked NATO out during the time of de Gaulle, and then France came back into the military structure many years later. Turkey and Greece, there's always the potential for friction there. The Germans, there have been times when the Germans were not happy with the United States, but that was all manageable type stuff. This is the first time where I've seen my country do something that potentially is going to damage the cohesion of NATO and the trust, which has always been the secret sauce of NATO. I mean, we've never been perfect. Most nations have not done everything that they said they would do, but the Soviets and then the Russians were always pretty sure that if they were to attack a NATO country, they would get the full wrath of all of its members, including the United States. This friction that has come out of the statements from Mr. Miller at the White House and talk about Greenland has, I say, a gift to the Kremlin. I mean, they can't believe their luck that what's happening in the first year of the second Trump administration could lead to something that the Russians tried for 80 years to do. And the frustrating part is that it's a complete own goal. I mean, the Danes and the Greenlanders have always said, please come back. We'd love to have U.S. bases come back here. We'd love to have American companies dig for the minerals that are below the ice. So it's an open door that is being used, I think, again, for theater. The assertion that Greenland is covered with Chinese and Russian Navy vessels is absolutely not true. That's easily provable. That's why I don't think this is actually about security. This is about access to critical minerals that some people believe is under the ice there.
I wanted to talk a bit more about those historical precedents you mentioned. When I think about previous conflicts or potential conflicts between NATO states, I suppose the one that really stands out is Turkey and Greece, as you said, the invasion of Cyprus in, I think it was 1974 by Turkey. And if you look at the kind of rhetoric and posturing in the Eastern Mediterranean, as you say, there's always tension there. And it seems like both of those countries kind of have one another's military in the back of their minds as a potential threat. Do you have any insight into how those tensions were managed within NATO?
You're correct that both Turkey and Greece, most of their military seems to be for the purpose of dealing or deterring the other one. But yet, for decades, they have been allies together with all of us. At the military level, professional officers, leaders, both in the Turkish military and in the Greek military, understood that it was important to stay cool, to defend their nation's interests, but to avoid the getting caught up in what might be happening at the political level between presidents or prime ministers and ministers and so on. So that was part of it. When I was the commander of NATO Allied Land Command, which was headquartered in Izmir, Turkey, for 2 years, from 2012 to 2014, we had Greek officers working in the headquarters. The director of the staff was Greek, reported directly to the Turkish chief of staff, and this was normal. And that's part of how NATO has always managed these kind of things, is the integration of officers from different countries into the command and force structure. So that's part of it. The second part is that the United States, UK, and France have always been involved whenever these friction points would reveal themselves, typically over who owned what particular little island or who was in whose water or airspace. It was the French, the Brits, and the Americans that would help get it sorted and keep it from turning into something really bad. I think that will be the kind of approach that's necessary. Now, when you talk about the United States, Denmark, and Greenland, that, some other countries are going to have to help, number one, save us from ourselves, but also keep it from this thing from unraveling.
How would you imagine a U.S. takeover of Greenland would take place? If that task was given to you, if you were in your old job?
Honestly, I would refuse the order. I mean, I would see that as an illegal order. A NATO ally, Washington Treaty, which created NATO, the United States is signatory. A signed treaty is within our Constitution, therefore, U.S. law. And so that would be an illegal order is how I would look at it. So I would probably not be around to participate in the actual operation. But, and I say that not to be funny, but because it's such a serious thing that I hope that our senior officers are doing some reflection and thinking about this. I do believe it would be an illegal order. And they would have a duty to, first of all, make sure that they have notified the Secretary of Defense and all the other people in the administration. Hey, look, you're contemplating something that would be a violation of a treaty, which makes it illegal. So that's part of what's going on. Now, I think what I would like to see would be our allies. I mean, here's an opportunity to address what the administration claims is the reason they want Greenland is because of security. They're worried about China and Russia. And here's where Denmark and various other NATO allies, including Canada, but our European allies, could say, great, you guys have been over in Europe for 80 years helping protect us. Time for us to help protect you. So we're going to deploy troops, ships, whatever, and start, increase the presence around Greenland and in the North Atlantic to help protect you. I think that would create an interesting way to address what is this really about. The UK leads the Joint Expeditionary Force, the JEF, which is a really, really good swept up coalition of nations that have military capability, not NATO, but it's a subset, if you will, that can do things without having to have NATO approval, let's say. A big JEF exercise in and around Greenland, I think, might be useful.
You're pretty robustly critical then of the Trump foreign policy and maybe of this strategy from which these actions or these threatened actions has come from. I'm wondering if you have some sympathy, though, perhaps, for how the administration has approached some of this. I mean, Donald Trump makes the point, and I think probably fairly, that, he has thrown a bucket of cold water over European allies. He has forced them to start paying more for their own defense, which successive administrations have wanted to do and kind of struggled to compel the Europeans to do. And the other thing, I suppose, I was interested in your view on is that he's just sent US forces, supported by Britain apparently, to seize essentially a Russian or Iranian shadow fleet tanker in the North Atlantic, which looks like a much more robust enforcement of international law than we've seen before. I was wondering if there are elements of this kind of approach that you actually welcome.
This is a great question with about 100 different subparts to it, but let me take on 2 or 3 of those and then you push back on me. First of all, I was thrilled to see the administration enforcing sanctions. I mean, that's been a problem for years now. There's been a lot of sanctions levied against Russia and others, but they haven't always been enforced or they've been easy to work around. To see the administration going after these tankers now is exactly what should be done. I'm glad they did it. And I wish our allies in the Baltic region, for example, including UK, would do that against these other shadow fleet vessels that are taking Russian oil out through the Baltic Sea, about 3 ships per day, and delivering it to China and India and other customers. And that's how Russia pays for this terrible war it's waging against Ukraine. So I am all for the enforcement of sanctions as long as it's obviously done within a legal context. And once again, my God, the idea of fast roping from a helicopter onto a moving ship in the North Atlantic in the month of January, those are special women and men who are flying and doing that. But it's also interesting, we could have never done that mission without allies who allow us to fly in equipment and people to an airbase somewhere in UK or wherever it was, or to Iceland, from which we could then conduct this operation to seize that vessel. The intelligence sharing is so important. And this is why I am a critic of much that the administration does, because it damages the trust. And it's a large part of America's intelligence that it uses to do all the different things does not come from American satellites, but it comes from allies, both from a bilateral as well as within Five Eyes and other different sort of protocols. We depend on that. And we depend on access that allies give us in UK and Spain and Italy and Greece and Turkey and Germany and so on. So I'd always worry about that. Now, the president is 100% correct to be very harsh towards allies that are not living up to their obligations of Article 3. Everybody knows about Article 5. Article 3 of the Washington Treaty is where it says each nation is responsible for defending itself and being prepared to help others. And that's the source of the 2%, now 5%. It's a part of the treaty. And most nations, candidly, have not done what they're supposed to do. So the president, like all of his predecessors, is correct to do that. And, frankly, most Americans, including people like me who are longtime NATO advocates, are wondering, like, what the hell? Why aren't you guys doing what you should be doing? Now, I think I have to say this, recognizing who I'm talking to and who's in the audience. I am sick and tired of hearing Europeans whining about, it takes too long, we don't have enough, we can't afford it, the Russians might do this. Come on. I mean, the collective populations, economies, wealth, technology, capabilities, industry of all the countries of the EU, plus UK, plus Norway, plus Canada, plus Ukraine, plus Turkey, dwarfs Russia. I mean, not even close. And it certainly matches the United States. I think Europeans should be willing to take on a lot more responsibility and quit talking about it. If I hear one more person say we need to step up, I am going to step in front of a train.
Well, don't do that.
I'm sorry. I got
It's fine. No, we understand it's rhetorical. Say the worst comes to the worst. Say either Denmark is forced into a sale that it doesn't want to take part in, or say 3 plane loads of US Marines show up in Nuuk and raise the Stars and Stripes. What happens after that? Does NATO survive that, or is that it? The North Atlantic Alliance is a busted flush.
The United States is one of 32 nations in NATO. The reason the nations have been in a queue to join NATO is because of the threat to their security posed mainly by Russia. And that threat does not go away, regardless of whether or not the United States remains a good, reliable ally, or whatever else happens. That threat is still there, and so nations, including UK, will still need NATO, a collective security organization. And I mean, this thing has never been perfect, but it's been the most successful alliance in the history of the world since 1949. I'm reluctant to say it's the end of NATO just because of this. No doubt the damage is going to be severe if this progresses along the way that you just described. First of all, I'm going to send out a plea to your audience. Don't give up on the United States. The Congress has failed its job this first year, but this year I have a feeling that we're going to see more pushback from the Republican leadership in the Congress on things that the president wants to do. I could be wrong, obviously, but this is an election year, and that's going to affect how many of them think about things and do things. And as their voters and their different states and districts see what's going on, I think they are going to be more concerned about their own voters and less concerned about threats from the president or the party leadership. I can't prove that, but that's my sense. So don't give up on us. There's a lot of good people in the Congress that understand how important NATO is, that understand the damage that would be done if the administration pushed through on this Greenland idea. This is where Europe has agency as well. I mean, you have economic power, you have other things that could be done to cause the administration to pause.
Something you said earlier, you said when I said, if the president gave you the job of annexing Greenland, you would refuse the order because it's illegal. Now, a couple of things struck me about that. One is, I suppose, it's easier to say that when you're out of uniform than when you're in uniform. I'm not for a second kind of questioning your own principles, but there is a big dilemma for any officer disobeying a direct order, especially in a culture where the military command has to be subordinate to the elected civilian government. And the other thing that's kind of related to that, which struck me, is that we're seeing politics and foreign policy and military actions and almost everything in the United States, I suppose, become so polarized and so politicized. I'm wondering how difficult you think it is for your former colleagues in uniform to kind of maintain the impartiality which has always been part of the job description for US officers. And each of them will have their own private political views, I suppose. How do you think they're coping with this? And do you think there are people who share your views who may be having to consider refusing orders?
This is why I think it's important for the retired flag officer, especially at the 4-star level. I mean, I'm a retired 3-star. The 4-stars are the ones that have the real impact. And I think that they have a responsibility to speak out on things because it is so difficult for those who are in uniform to do that. I'm very confident that those in uniform are pushing back in a lot of ways, as they should, behind closed doors. You don't want to have an argument between the uniform and the civilian leadership in public. But my guess is that, these kind of debates are happening inside the Pentagon the way they should. Now, at the end of the day, the retired guys, I think, can and should be more involved in explaining why this is a problem. What is the damage to our alliance and to the relationships with countries? That's something that they can do more effectively. And there are a couple of them that are out there doing that. On the other part of this, though, is in the culture, the Army is 251 years old. I know that doesn't mean much to Europeans, but the U.S. Army is 1 year older than the country, actually. And from the beginning, this idea of subservience to the civilian leadership, it's always been there. And also in the culture, the presumption of legality of orders is there. The whole system is based on the presumption that orders are lawful, and it's your duty to carry them out to the best of your ability. Even if it's a stupid order or a terrible policy, if it's not illegal, you have to do it. But you do have a responsibility to disobey an unlawful order. The hard part is you better be sure that it is unlawful. It's much more difficult for a soldier at the bottom of the chain to make that determination than it is for an officer higher up. And that's why it was our responsibility. And look, I'm old enough. I started West Point in the summer of 1976. I was a brand new cadet there. And so 1976, this was right after the end of our war in Vietnam. The My Lai massacre, all of this stuff was fresh in everybody's mind. All of the faculty were Vietnam veterans. And they emphasized that it would be our duty when we became officers to never obey an unlawful order, that you could not hide behind what then was referred to as the Nuremberg defense. You can't say, well, I was just following orders. And so this is not something new. It's in our culture. This is going to be a challenge going forward.
Did you ever have to disobey what you thought was an illegal order in your career?
I never had to disobey something, but there were times where I ignored or maybe found a way to accomplish what they wanted in a way that was in accordance with the law.
Can I throw one last kind of, it's a bit frivolous, to be honest. I tend to do this with our longer kind of feature interviews, but I thought, why not? I'll throw it at you. We tend to ask people kind of, what's their favorite movie about their profession or their background? Is there a film that you particularly like as a former soldier?
Yeah, Master and Commander is by far my favorite sort of military movie. Even though it's about the Navy, I mean, they really capture the challenges of being a commander, the importance of what goes on inside a crew or a ship or a team. And I love watching that movie. But I also tell you, I've watched probably 15 times Top Gun Maverick because it's such a, again, and I'm an infantryman. I mean, I was not a Navy pilot, but they captured so well the human aspects of command and of leadership. And I liked it. Those are the ones I liked.
I like the bit where they improbably steal an F-14 Tomcat from what appears to be the Iranian Air Force. That was Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, retired, a former commander of US ground forces in Europe. That's all for this edition of Battle Lines. As I said at the top of the podcast, things have been moving very quickly in international affairs this week. We'll be back on Monday with our usual Start the Week episode. Until then, that was Battle Lines. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles and hosted by me, Roland Oliphant, and Venetia Rainey. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others to find the show. To stay on top of all our news, subscribe to The Telegraph, sign up to our Dispatches newsletter, or listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. You can also get in touch directly by emailing battlelines@telegraph.co.uk or contact us on X. You can find our handles in the show notes. The producer is Peter Shevlin, and the executive producer is Louisa Wells.